Ready to go?
One sec. Go ahead. All you.
All right. All right. Let's take a look here. All right. Hello, welcome everyone. Both here in the in Zoom and on the live stream. I am Jared Bly. I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'm affiliated with Villanova University as well as a critical theory workshop. So first and foremost, I want to some thanks are in order here. I want to first thank Midwestern Marx, who's our co-sponsor for this event. And also, of course, the Critical Theory Workshop being the other sponsor. And want to encourage everyone who's watching or maybe listening later to follow and like both Midwestern Marx and the CTW. Some very quick announcements. I'll do this very quickly here. For the CTW, the Critical Theory Workshop, there's a number of events. We will also, in due time, drop the event links in the chat if anyone wants to use those. But some upcoming events. So on April 22nd, we have an event with Vijay Prasad. And on April 27th, there's going to be the book launch for the book by Emmanuel Ness. All of these things will be live streamed and then eventually put up on YouTube if you can't make it on the date. There's also the announcement here for the Critical Theory Summer School. We are taking applications actively. The deadline to apply is going to be May 1st. And again, we'll drop some links in the chat for this. Finally, we want to encourage you to support both Midwestern Marx and the Critical Theory Workshop in any way you can, beyond simply just liking and subscribing to our platforms. We have Patreons that, and again, the links will be in the chat that you can, if you feel it, if the spirit moves you in your heart to donate, that would be great. There's also going to be a link in a similar capacity for Midwestern Marx. That is all for our little advertisements here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So this is going to be Heidegger on the left. We have 3 speakers today, and the first is Colin Bodale. Colin Bodale teaches philosophy at Villanova University and specializes in 19th and 20th century German philosophy. Very happy to present here to be involved in this with Colin. But Colin, you want to take it away?
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. So something about, I'll start with a little bit of biography. I think I first heard about Heidegger in an intro to philosophy class. I think before that, actually, somebody had mentioned him, and I was like, what? Who is this Nazi philosopher? But then in this intro to philosophy class, the professor described this philosophy that was all about angst, this feeling of like dread in the face of possibility, the whole discussion of like finitude and being towards death, which is something that when I was 18, I hadn't really wrestled with before. And I was also enthralled by this esoteric vocabulary that he used. And so I ended up spending a great deal of my 20s studying Heidegger, learning German so that I could read his works in the original language. And something that Daniel Tutt mentions in his book on Nietzsche is that, you wouldn't think that Nietzsche, who's highly referential and has this, he is a difficult reader to read, would be so popular among everyday people. But there's something about the fact that you don't fully understand Nietzsche that makes him even more enticing. And I think Heidegger's vocabulary has a very similar effect. You don't understand it, but you want to, and something eludes you about it. And for me, it was the mystery and difficulty that made Heidegger so interesting and sent me on a quest to go figure out, go find being for such a long time. And I think many people read Heidegger in the formative years and then later become involved in leftist politics and try to make some kind of synthesis between Heidegger and historical materialism. And Heidegger even throws a bone to the left in a letter on humanism. He talks about this whole idea of a constructive dialogue with Marxism. And so there's this temptation here. And so something I've been doing, which is, in some ways a self-critique, is trying to argue against this synthesis and to actually draw a line of demarcation between Heideggerian thought and historical materialism. And I think it's not enough to just reject Heidegger, the person, because he was a Nazi, an anti-Semite, and has this, very fascistic core to some of his philosophical ideas, because Heideggerian thought has been so influential. And so Emmanuel Fay, for example, argues that we should take Heidegger off the shelves and put him next to like Himmler and Goebbels. Well, I mean, that's not going to fix anything, because like Heidegger's thought is still going to be influential through like Derrida, Gadamer, Arendt, Foucault, and all these thinkers who draw upon Heidegger. So I think that this this idea of just like rejecting Heidegger the person and not reading him is not helpful, because we actually need to like engage with the ideas and criticize them and formulate a position against them. And this is Heidegger obviously wrote a lot of things, and he kind of has a way of writing like Leibniz, where every text is kind of a self-contained whole. And so I'm just going to focus on one aspect of Heidegger's thinking in this discussion, which is Heidegger's theory of time and his theory of history. And my goal in this talk is going to be to draw a line of demarcation between the Heideggerian theory of time and history and the historical materialist theory of time and history. And Lukács, in The Destruction of Reason, writes, quote, Heidegger, even with regard to the theory of time and the reading of history closely associated with it, was chiefly attacking the new adversary, the historical materialism, whose influence was being felt in all areas of life. So according to Lukács, Heidegger's theory of time and his reading of history are actually an attack on historical materialism. Now, being in time is not usually read as an attack on historical materialism, but we find hints of this throughout the text. Like in his section on history, for example, Heidegger makes a passing comment about laws of history, right? I mean, it sounds like it's targeting historical materialism, but I think even more telling, the second to last section of Being in Time is a critique of the dialectical account of time. It's a critique of Hegel, and often a critique of Hegel is also a critique of historical materialism by proxy. And we jump ahead to 1962. Heidegger gives the lecture on time and being, and Heidegger again brings up the dialectical concept of time. And here he says, the relationship between being and time, being and time, being and time is contradictory. There's a contradiction between being and time. And one of the solutions to this contradiction is dialectics. And Heidegger says that dialectics allows the contradictions to stand and even sharpens them. So here again, Heidegger's talking about the dialectical theory of time found in the tradition of historical materialism, and he's juxtaposing his own theory of time and his own theory of history to this dialectical account of time. So what is it about time that's contradictory that Heidegger's talking about here? Heidegger's referring to the following problem. It seems that time does not exist. The past no longer exists, the future does not yet exist, and the present is constantly fleeting, infinitely divisible, and can't be pinned down. It seems, therefore, that no part of time exists, since neither past, present, nor future exist, and that if no part of time exists, then time does not exist. These paradoxes were discussed at length by the Eleatics, by Aristotle in Book 4 of the Physics, and Hegel in The Logic and the Philosophy of Nature. The dialectical account of time, I think Heidegger quite rightly points out, allows the contradictions to stand. Dialectical philosophy follows Heraclitus in understanding time and motion to be this contradictory process of continual negation and change. As Hegel says in The Science of Logic, paraphrasing here, the ancient dialecticians must be granted the contradictions they pointed out in time and motion, but that doesn't mean that time and motion don't exist, but that contradiction exists. Time and motion for Hegel and for the dialectical tradition are real contradictions. Similarly, with regard to time itself, Hegel writes in The Philosophy of Nature, time is that being which, insofar as it is not, and insofar as it is not, it is. And historical materialism follows Hegel on these points and grounds its theory of history in this understanding of time as a contradictory movement of the now negating itself to become the future, the past being this result of an inner contradiction that negates it and puts it into the past. And the historical materialist tradition argues that by understanding the internal contradictions within society, within nature, within the world, we can look at where things are headed, like where's the seed of irrationality that's going to lead to the destruction of the present moment and bring about a new moment. Consider, for example, all the fossil fuel we're burning. It makes a lot of money now, but you know who you're going to sell it to when the planet's gone, right? This is kind of a performative contradiction that I think helpfully, quickly illustrates the kinds of contradictions in our society that point to the future, point to the seeds of change. And so the theory of time, the dialectical theory of time, informs the theory of history of historical materialism. Likewise, for Heidegger, Heidegger's theory of time informs his theory of history, his theory of authentic history. So then we've talked about, very briefly, I could go into more detail about the Zeno's paradoxes and stuff like that, but it's, it's a bit detailed. But we've seen that there's this contradiction in relation to time, and we've seen that there's a dialectical account that Heidegger's rejected. So what does Heidegger say about these problems when it comes to time, when it comes to these contradictions within the existence of time? Well, Heidegger claims that we've misunderstood the relationship between being and time. Heidegger says that we usually start with being. We say, things are or are not, right? And then we say, okay, is time one of the things that has being? Does time exist? Heidegger says that we need to start with time, and then we need to understand being on the basis of time. And Heidegger wants to say that time is the horizon for the understanding of being. At least this is what he wanted to prove in Being and Time. We know he never finished the book. In fact, Heidegger claims that that being must always be understood in terms of time, but since the Greeks, and here we get into his tenuous and Eurocentric history of philosophy, which I don't think holds up to scrutiny, but he claims at least, and this claim about presence in the Greek does have some etymological basis, but it's that being has always been understood in terms of the now, in terms of the temporal present. So if we understand being in terms of the now, and then we ask if time exists, time just seems like a series of nows. That's Heidegger's argument. So we say that when we say that something exists, we mean that it exists now. We say dinosaurs have no being, they don't exist because they don't currently exist, right? They had being in an old now, but they don't have being now. And Heidegger claims, however, that we need to understand time to be the intersection of future, past, and present, what he calls ecstatic temporality. And his argument for this is to claim that human existence cannot be reduced to existence within the present moment, within the now, and that is Dasein. And this is Heidegger's word for human beings, the types of beings that we are, and there's a whole nest of problems that I'm not going to open up with his use of this term. Lisordo is quite good on this point. But he says that Dasein can't be reduced to something vorhanden, or present at hand. This is Heidegger's idiosyncratic translation of the ordinary word existentia, existence, the word for just existence in the normal sense of it. If we treat human beings as something with an existence that can be reduced to the now, to the present, Heidegger claims this involves treating them like an object, not as a person, a what, not a who. And so what is Heidegger's argument for this? Well, he says that human beings have this ecstatic temporality of future, past, and present all being entangled and entwined together, and that human beings primarily exist in terms of the future. For example, I'm a teacher, but am I a teacher when I stop teaching? Am I a teacher when I go to sleep? If I stop being a teacher when I go to sleep, that doesn't make a lot of sense. What makes more sense is to say that I am no longer a teacher if I'm not going to teach tomorrow, if I'm not going to teach in the future, when I no longer have this possibility projected ahead of myself in the future. So that's why Heidegger claims that the being of human beings must be understood in terms of the future tense, in terms of the possibilities we project in front of ourselves. And this is a problem that Aristotle solves in a different way by saying that, being a teacher is a power, a dunamis. It's something that I can actualize, but it's like there is a power that I can use and I'm not actualizing. Heidegger seems to reject this solution, though, because of this whole notion of being towards death being this thing in the future that seems to have an impact on our present, but can't actually be present to us subjectively, like we can't experience death. And so Heidegger develops this whole theory of ecstatic temporality, where we project ourselves toward the future, but what we project towards the future, we take from the past, and then we act in the moment, the Augenblick is what he calls it, resolutely, when we stand committed to whatever potential or possibility we're pushing in front of ourselves or holding in front of ourselves. Now, and Kierkegaard could be quoted here, life may be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Now, this might be fine as a description of how human beings experience time, but Heidegger wants to say this is the primordial sense of time, that objective time, real time, scientific time, clock time is a derivative distortion of this more primordial sense of ecstatic temporality. And so I think that and I try to go into some of these details in the article, why the left should reject Heidegger. But I think that there's a clear subjectivity or subjective basis for ecstatic temporality. And I think that Heidegger, in his, he claims to be beyond the subject-object distinction, but what he really ends up doing is reducing objectivity to human finitude as this thing that emerges out of our subjective sense of time. So then that's Heidegger's theory of time. How does it inform Heidegger's theory of history? Heidegger understands history through the lens of this ecstatic temporality. For Heidegger, the authentic relationship to history, what he calls authentic history, as opposed to, trying to actually figure out what happened and give an objective account of history. Authentic history involves looking to the past to find possibilities to the future. Authentic history is not about understanding what really happened or why it happened, but about repeating possibilities handed down by a historical tradition. We take up the possibilities from the tradition, or we take up like the possibility of like some heroic way of life that we've seen in the past, and we try to repeat it and relive it in a new way in the future. So, and this is something Heidegger takes from Nietzsche's use and misuse of history for life. He like literally just quotes it in Being and Time. I think at best, what this view of history turns into is a hermeneutics of endless readings and rereadings. My joke is that, if Hegel thought that philosophy was thought thinking itself, deconstruction sees philosophy as texting itself, right? But this would be the endless repeating readings and rereadings. Because for Heidegger, ideas and philosophy is constantly being like stagnated and reduced to formulas. And so they need to be constantly retrieved and renewed to provide new possibilities for thinking in the future. Yet this Heideggerian theory of history also has very troubling political implications. So Heidegger's politics, and these are the politics in Being and Time, 1927, before Hitler came to power, it's a future-oriented understanding of history. It's taking ideas from the past and projecting them in the future. But what he ends up doing is he grounds this notion of the community or the Gemeinschaft through this idea of retrieving or repeating possibilities from history, of taking out a tradition and carrying it out. And here Heidegger uses the term destiny, Geschick, to indicate this historical community, calling destiny the happening, the Geschehen, of the community, Gemeinschaft, of the people, folk. And so the community for Heidegger is based in future-oriented temporality, and this is about finding heroic ideas and traditions for this historic destiny of the folk, and creating basically a folk ideology out of that history. And what binds the folk together for Heidegger is, and again, Being on Time, 1927, before Hitler came to power, it's Kampf, it's struggle. It's, he says, in communication and struggle, the power of destiny first becomes free. So destiny is this power that binds people together, and it emerges through struggle. And here, Heidegger elaborates further in his 1934 Holderlin seminar, where he, which is one of his most political texts and one of his most reactionary texts. And here he talks about the comradeship of soldiers on the front. What brings this community of soldiers together is he says the nearness of death and sacrifice. Basically, being towards death for Heidegger individuates people. It turns them into isolated people, just like experiencing resolutely their death and like living towards it. On the front, the whole community is like being towards its death. And that's what creates the community. I think that this Heideggerian approach to history of retrieving possibilities from the past in order to repeat them in the future is at best idealist. At worst, it's very reactionary and fascistic. Heidegger fetishizes like battle and struggle in this way. And it's important to notice here that he's not talking about the struggle of a community for liberation. That would be something different. That would be you have a community that's struggling for liberation, and then that community builds greater solidarity in the mutual struggle. He's talking about the formation of a community through struggle. Like the struggle comes first, and that forms the community. Domenico Losordo identifies this as part of the war ideology, the Kriegsideologie, that would later inform the Third Reich. So Heidegger's Being and Time, according to Losordo, is part of this tradition of war ideology, this like fetishization of battle and the sense of community that soldiers felt during World War I, that then becomes this ideology that you find in all the writings prior to Hitler, and then becomes part of Nazi ideology. And I think that this Heideggerian kind of heroic idea of history and this Heideggerian idea of community has the potential to go south very quickly. If we simply retrieve the past as some heroic model to be followed without analyzing the very real problems and contradictions within this past and learn from them, and then approach the real problems and contradictions in the present based on what we've learned, but merely just heroicize the past, this can be very potentially dangerous. And I don't think that this aspect of Heidegger should be combined with leftist thought, because it can very easily lead away from a commitment to universal solidarity with all oppressed peoples and turn into a fascistic and reactionary distortion of left politics, where the community is based on this differentiation with this enemy in this kind of Schmittian way. And Heidegger gets more and more Schmittian in his later writings. I think it's also no surprise that the far right very heavily draws on these aspects of Heidegger's philosophy, this notion of the Gemeinschaft, destiny, and struggle. And so the historical materialist alternative, what would that be? Well, instead of uncritically conjuring up the ghosts of the past to serve as models for today, perhaps we should instead follow the advice of Marx in the 18th Brumaire, who writes, "The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about the past." So, for all the people who say dialectical philosophy has no concept of the future, I mean, there it is. Historical materialism does not attempt to retrieve or repeat the past for the sake of creating some notion of a community centered around a tradition, nor should it look to the past for the historical destiny of a people. The historical materialist looks to the past precisely to show how the stories we tell ourselves about the past are illusions, are superstitions, are ghosts that are haunting us and keeping us from really dealing with the present reality. And so the task of historical materialism as a historical method, as a method for reading texts, is actually to attack these illusions, to strip away the superstitions regarding the past, and to show that everything is subject to change, that everything past has been past. And I think Engels is quite interesting on this point, and I'll conclude with this, where he talks in Ludwig Feuerbach about the reversal of Hegel's double Satz, where Hegel says that the actual is the rational is the actual. And Engels says the dialectical reversal of this is the irrational is inactual. Everything irrational deserves to perish. Everything irrational carries the germ of destruction within itself. And that, I think, is the sense of future that we get in historical materialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really great way to start us off. We're going to move right along. Our next speaker is Daniel Tutt. Daniel Tutt is a philosopher and writer. He teaches at George Washington University, Marymount University, and additionally hosts conversations and seminars with leading thinkers in Marxist thought and philosophy with the Emancipations podcast program, which also includes a study group collective. Tutt is the author of 2 books. The first is Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, and the second is How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. Welcome, Daniel, and take it away.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Gabriel Rockhill. Thank you to the Critical Theory Workshop. Thank you to Midwestern Marx. I'm very excited for this event. It allowed me to reopen a lot of research that I've done on Heidegger and post-Marxism. So the conclusion of my talk will look at what I call the inevitable permutations of Heideggerian thinking in post-Marxism. But I want to start with a conversation about the origin of the kind of rapprochement, or the synthesis, or the attempted synthesis of Heidegger with Marx. So when Lucien Goldmann argued that Heidegger's Being in Time, which was published in 1927, only 4 years after History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923 by Lukács, said that this text was a response to Lukács's text. Goldmann's comment was never elaborated on in further detail. However, I think we can infer from it that Goldman meant that Heidegger's text contains a philosophical rebuttal of Lukács, but one that is posed from the standpoint of bourgeois philosophy. While it's true that Heidegger possessed a very poor understanding of Marx and that he never fully read Capital, as Herbert Marcuse, his student, attests, it is also true that the problems that Lukács opens in History and Class Consciousness, particularly the problem of reification, or the condition that Heidegger would refer to as facticity, or the thingliness or objectification of the world, would align Lukács and Heidegger at a basic level. Heidegger, in Being and Time, offers an account of alienation as what he calls inauthentic existence in the world, but he strips this account of all materialist or social accounts of power or society from his theories of history and ontology. For Lukács, when the individual in bourgeois society confronts objective reality, he is faced by a complex of ready-made and unalterable objects, which allow him only the subjective responses of recognition or rejection. And it is only the class that can relate to the whole of reality in a practical and a revolutionary way. Lukács argues that it is only the practical class consciousness of the proletariat that possesses the ability to transform the modern condition of reification or alienated consciousness. Reification is then the necessary immediate reality of every living person in capitalist society, but it can be overcome by constant and constantly renewed efforts to disrupt the reified structure of existence by concretely relating to the concretely manifested contradictions of the total development of capitalist society. In other words, by becoming conscious of the immanent meanings of these contradictions of bourgeois society and how they relate to the total development of the social order. Bourgeois thought is inadequate to achieve such a task because it is unmediated and has entered into a relationship with reality as it is given. The bourgeoisie cannot mediate itself with itself through negativity because it stands in an antagonistic relation to the proletariat or to the working class. And thus, the bourgeoisie cannot posit itself for itself as the universal class because it is constituted as an inherently exclusive social class. Thus, the bourgeois standpoint is fundamentally anti-revolutionary precisely because the development of its own self-interest is reliant on the oppression of the working class, and when its self-interest is elevated to the general organizing principle of society, this elevation only reveals its class complicity in a self-contradictory form of social existence. That is why the achievement of the consciousness of the bourgeois standpoint would be equivalent to self-suicide in Lukács's account. The bourgeoisie cannot be described as a class in and for itself. If it were to realize itself as a class, it would only be as a partial form of universalism. And this realization would self-contradict its founding principles and ideals that we remember emerged from the glorious French Revolution of freedom, equality, and liberty. Now, in this context, Lukács argues that the real issue at hand is the creation of organizational forms and institutional intermediaries that would be capable of forging a new relation of the proletarian working class to what Lukács calls the totality, or to a socially mediate form of organization and practical activity that would be capable of realizing the task of the proletariat in abolishing itself as a class. How is this task to become a historical mission embedded into the motives and objects of its action in history? This involves the realization of the proletariat as a historical agent. But the objective conditions of the crisis of capitalism cannot reach their full maturity without the development of self-consciousness as a consciousness of the need for de-alienation amongst the proletariat. Within this consciousness, what is crucial is that there be an aspiration towards totality, which I mentioned before, or towards the historical realization of the proletariat as a class in itself, wherein what is reflected in the consciousness of the proletariat is a new positive reality arising out of the dialectical contradictions of capitalism, a realization into the suffering of the proletariat is not sufficient in this regard. There must be an additional reflection into the positive reality of its unique capacity for mediating and thus overcoming the social forms of bourgeois social life. The task that Marx sets for the proletarian revolution of the self-abolition of the proletariat can be defined as abolishing the conditions of dehumanization, not merely the abolition of economic exploitation as the primary end. But this cannot be achieved without the conscious action of the class that can and must free itself. And the abolition of the class in itself would be a contradiction in terms if things were left to an unconscious force of some sort of mythical conception of historical necessity. We thus see that Lukács avoids a pure messianism in history and class consciousness, in which class abolition would be thought either as a voluntarist or immediate spontaneity of revolution itself. He rather thinks this abolition dialectically, as a new form of mediation that would be other than bourgeois mediation, which, to repeat, attempts a historical mediation that will inevitably face a contradiction at the level of its social being that would prevent the class from progressing to a dialectical realization of its own universal emancipatory potential, precisely because the bourgeois class is complicit at a material basis of interest in the oppression of the status quo. But with the weight of history and the events of the 20th century, from the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 to the Communist Revolution in China, any Marxist thinking a proletarian revolution has set itself the task of overcoming reification. And this fact of revolution being something that entails an overcoming of the total alienation of the working class has been the site where Heidegger's thought and his ontological conceptions and reflections on history have entered into the picture of Marxism. Now, I want to turn to what I think is the first attempt at a synthesis of Heidegger with Marx in the work of Herbert Marcuse. Although Marcuse would later come to completely reject Heidegger, he did write several essays on Heidegger's ontology and its implications for historical materialism in the 1920s, prior to the rise of the Nazis in the early 30s. In fact, Marcuse confesses later that he never read Heidegger during this time as an explicitly political thinker, and nor did Sartre, Lefebvre, and many other Marxists of the time. Pierre Bourdieu, in his incredible book on Heidegger's political ontology, argues that these Marxist philosophers engaged in what he called a philosophical communication with Heidegger, in which their social unconsciousness, Heidegger's and the Marxists, did not classify Heidegger as a right-wing thinker. Marcuse was drawn to Heidegger for reasons of a perceived inadequacy implicit in the Marxist theory of revolution. But perhaps ironically, it was the publication of Marx's 1844 manuscripts, published right before the Nazis came to power in the early 1930s, that led Marcuse, in fact, to abandon his allegiance to Heidegger, because he famously said, once I read Marx's 1844 philosophic and economic manuscripts, I no longer needed Heidegger for Marxism, precisely because the publication of these manuscripts pointed to what Marcuse was looking for as a missing element, namely a theory of revolution. Okay, for starters, it is important to understand that for Heidegger, Dasein, or human being in the world, is always a concrete Dasein, realized in a particular historical situation and according to a very particular essence. It constitutes itself in also a historical process. And in the modern period, Heidegger claims that Dasein is thrown being in the world, and as such, it is always determined by its world and not simply in the mode of fallenness in relationship to some they, or to what Heidegger calls das Man. This means that there is a fundamental contingency of Dasein, and it can be realized, therefore, in any collective as a form of destiny, whether that collective be nationalist, whether it be an ethnic group or whether it be a class. None of that is analyzed by Heidegger. And thus, for Heidegger, history, or what he calls historicity, offers a theory of the historical realization of Dasein for individuals and for any collective or entity. But this analysis of the historical destiny and realization of Dasein is done with an analysis that has a complete neutralization of any conception of society, of power, etc. For Marcuse, the Heideggerian Marxist rapprochement revolves around Heidegger's conception of history as Gescheit, which is a form of history that signifies a happening. Gescheit refers not to a contemplative or to a sort of scholarly conceptual form of history. It's rather history as what Heidegger refers to as a call to arms, what was before mentioned as struggle, right? It is a summons, history as a summons to an authentic form of ontological realization, right? This is the site of where Marcuse thought there was something missing in Marx before he read the 1844 manuscripts. It's crucial to note that for Heidegger, at issue in the historical realization of Dasein is a theory of the act, an act which will deliver an authentic release or withdrawal from the world of Das Man, or the anonymous anyone of modern alienated social life. You could use reification for that. But once again, the Heideggerian account of modern enemy or alienation, to which the Das Man or the they is analyzed as an esoteric account of alienation. Lukács provides the best analysis of Heidegger's esoteric and ultimately mystical theory of Dasein in The Destruction of Reason. This is a text that was published after the Second World War, but which was actually written in the same immediate German context in which Heidegger was working from the time of the publication of Being and Time in 1927 to the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. Lukács shows that Heidegger's conception of Dasein is a theory of being that is construed as completely independent of experience, cognition, and comprehension. But yet Dasein or being still is. This account of being in ontology amounts to a quasi-mystical account of being, precisely because being is outside of human consciousness and is thus made, and thus by existence, by the term existence, Heidegger refers to a kind of vulgar, pure human existence as such. Heidegger's wider account of alienation, or the anonymous anyone of Das Man, and inauthentic existence, must therefore be understood as a reflection, according to Lukács, of Heidegger's own explicit class experience and the crisis of bourgeois society of his time. Heidegger's philosophy must be understood as a projection of this social crisis and decay, as an attempt of a generalization of this condition into a static claim on the general condition of modernity as such. For his part, Lukács and Marcuse, who was Heidegger's student, as I mentioned, both argue that Heidegger avoided any conception of history or society in his analysis of modern Dasein. For Marcuse, this was forgivable because it made Heidegger into what he called a transcendental idealist, to which a Marxist materialist supplementation could be offered as a corrective to Heidegger's otherwise aloof bourgeois philosophy. Marcuse, to his credit, shows that even in the later work of Heidegger on technology and technics, Heidegger treats technology as a force in itself, and he once again removes and avoids any discussion of the social context or power relations of technology entirely. Now, as I mentioned, Lukács argues that Heidegger's core idea of being in the world is a projection of the class position of alienated bourgeois experience. And that is why all of the primary categories that make up Heidegger's notion of inauthentic existence, idle talk, curiosity, ambiguity, falling, being thrown, must all be taken back to the concrete social being of bourgeois society, and therefore Heidegger represents the peak, the ultimate summit of bourgeois philosophy in the period of late imperialism, prior to the rise of fascism. This analysis of Heidegger is given even more sociological support in Pierre Bourdieu's analysis of Heidegger's philosophy as the invention of what he calls new political theology concepts that Bourdieu says we must understand as a response to the social misery of the culture of Heidegger's time. This is how we must read the implicit radicalism of Heideggerian thought and why his concepts of history and the authentic act contain a loaded and a latent radicalism. But to truly grasp this radicalism requires that we deploy an understanding not merely of Heidegger as a supplementation to Marx's theory of historical materialism. I want to argue that we must proceed on the basis of a comparison that is purely homologous, but not in any way analogous. A homology between Heideggerian historicity and Marx's sense of the proletarian revolution could offer, if it's done carefully, important insights for Marxist thought. Marcuse agrees with Lukács in his diagnosis of Heidegger's philosophy as the highest expression of bourgeois philosophy. Specifically, for Marcuse, Heidegger was explaining the subjective side of the bourgeois mind, and that you can understand the entirety of Heidegger's philosophy as the peak of bourgeois philosophy without any consideration of the economic categories. This is evident in Heidegger's introduction to metaphysics, where he argues that liberalism and communism are metaphysically identical. Liberalism and communism, for Heidegger, are both equalitarian humanist doctrines committed only to materialist flourishing. So as you've gathered, there's nothing of materialism in Heidegger. But embedded in his idea of the authentic act, we find something very close to what Lukács had articulated in History and Class Consciousness. This takes us back to Lucien Goldmann's original point. To quote Marcuse, when revolutionary practice is known as authentic historical existence, and when concrete change is recognized as the real movement of the world, bourgeois society can finally be seen in its historical becoming and necessary fallenness. And here's the crucial point that Marcuse teases out. There is a Dasein whose thrownness consists precisely in the overcoming of its own thrownness. The historical act is only possible today as the act of the proletariat, because it is only the Dasein of the proletariat within whose existence this act is necessarily given. Historical materialism, according to Marcuse, can thus supplement Heidegger's absent social materialist analysis by providing an adequate context of the class struggle and by inserting the social being of the proletarian class as that class which can only discover its own thrownness by overcoming its thrownness. At this point, we can see that Marx and Heidegger both hold an ontological account of thrownness or alienation. But Marx would give this the name of estrangement in 1844 Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, where he elaborates that the alienation of human labor implies that the theory of revolution not merely touch the economic base of society, but that revolution must be construed at the species level of humanity, species being level of humanity, and therefore that revolution be thought as a total revolution of the reconciliation of the human as such. In 1844, for Marx, the subject of revolution is the human essence in its totality. Human freedom for Marx implies that man's capacity to relate to his own object of labor connects man into a wider set of social relations and generic life. For the Marx of 1844, still working under the influence of Feuerbach, the Hegelian idea of objectification contains an ontological foundation in what Marx calls the sensuousness of man, which was, as you may know, the beginning point of Feuerbach's theory of the science of humanity. It begins in sensuousness. But In capitalist society, man must convert his labor into a commodity, and this creates an alienation of man's core life object, insofar as he no longer belongs to himself. This is what objectification is. Objectification makes man into an animal. We see now that the homology emerges between the early Marx and Heidegger around this objectification, or what Heidegger would call thrownness or facticity. Historical materialism must concern itself with giving an account, therefore, in Marcuse's view, of the ruptures and the transformations of the changes to this precise condition of alienated humanity. And revolution, therefore, must be understood and studied as moments in history in which the essence of humanity is restored from its thrownness. If, as Marx claims, man is not one with his life activity and his life activity is labor, the object of revolution becomes man himself, and therefore the object of revolution becomes total. The point where the inhumanity of this alienation or reification is most acute, of course, is concentrated within private property. The fundamental class analysis of the Marx of 1844 is one in which the worker's alienation, importantly, is found in the worker's activity, whereas for bourgeoisie, it is found in non-work. Therefore, both classes are alienated, but one is alienated in their activity, proletariat, and the other is alienated in a condition, in a state. This distinction is crucial. One can see that the notion of thrownness or facticity would therefore align with the conception that Marcuse tried to draw out from Heidegger, which is that only the revolutionary working class movement of the proletariat can reveal this state or condition of the bourgeoisie's own alienation. What Marcuse's attempted synthesis of Heidegger with Marx opens, I think, is a focus on the historical realization of revolution as a total ontological transformation or event. The basis of this homology between Marx and Heidegger has been taken, in fact, into the heart of contemporary Marxist thought after the Second World War, where there is a perceived inadequacy embedded in Marxist revolutionary thought about how to deal with the problem of the superstructure, or of the fact that the 20th century faced very turbulent revolutions that succeeded in revolutionizing the base or the economic level of society. But these revolutions in the base only seemed to perpetuate the problem of fetishism. It kept fetishism intact. It kept facticity, in some sense, intact. This is the claim of Marxists, right? Now, I want to make some observations about this claim. And my next section is entitled Dialectics and Ontology, Why Heidegger is Inescapable in Post-Marxism. How am I doing on time, Jared? 5 minutes over?
Yeah, you're about 5 minutes over, so maybe an
okay.
abridgment would be good.
An abridgment. Okay. Well, I'm happy that I got Marcuse's attempted synthesis out on the table. But in my final point, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that French Marxism after 1968 adopted a fundamental Heideggerian conception of ontology, which is problematic on two levels. On the one, which was actually oddly enough pointed out by Adorno, where Adorno remarks that ontology, when it is incorporated into Marxist analysis, shuts down dialectics, in essence, and that this has led to a sort of dualism embedded within contemporary Marxism, which Michel Cluscard refers to as a new form of neo-Kantianism, right? Whereby politics is thought as a rare eventual emergence from an ontological ground. And this actually leads to the reemergence of a kind of post-class form of thinking politics that I find actually quite inadequate. And so I analyzed Laclau and Mouffe, Deleuze, Guattari, Hart, Negri, and even Alain Badiou, who I otherwise often find very insightful. as all possessing a type of latent left Heideggerianism, right? And perhaps in our discussions, we can talk more about this, but that's ultimately the sort of problem of what I refer to as the kind of total victory of Heidegger over contemporary post-Marxism. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Moving right along now, our last but not least, our final speaker will be Carlos L. Garrido. He's a Cuban-American philosophy instructor at Southern Illinois University, University Carbondale. He is also the director of Midwestern Marx Institute and the author of The Purity Fetish and The Crisis of Western Marxism in 2023. Also the author of Marxism in the Dialectical Materialist Worldview in 2022. And forthcoming, his next book will be entitled Hegel, Marxism, and Dialectics, coming out this year. Also, in addition here, he has written for dozens of scholarly and popular publications around the world, and runs various live broadcast shows for the Midwestern Marx Institute on YouTube. And the links also are in the description, as we already said. So take it away, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Jared, and thank you to all the organizers of this event and to Colin and Daniel for their excellent presentations. I'm very excited to get into the conversation section and discuss some of what was said. My presentation is called On the Marxist Critique of Heidegger. Martin Heidegger is undoubtedly one of the most creative and influential philosophers of the 20th century. Virtually all areas of philosophy, along with many other disciplines as well, have had to tackle in one form or another the questions he poses and the insights he provides. His work grasped the zeitgeist of the 1930s and 40s for most of continental philosophy. It is a tour de force Marxist philosophers must face head on. Simply calling it bourgeois, Nazi, or the expression of the middle class state of being in post World War I Germany is not enough. While it is important to situate Heidegger in his proper historical and class context, and while it is essential to show how the Nazism and anti-Semitism, while it is essential to show the Nazism and anti-Semitism he was undoubtedly committed to for a significant period of his life, this is insufficient to defeat the thought of this giant. Other leftist scholars have already made tremendous inroads in this area. Since at least the publication of Heidegger's Black Notebook, but especially now with the publication of Richard Wollin's recent text, Heidegger in Ruins, the intimate connection between Heidegger and Nazism is indisputable, even though many, including those working within his Gesamtescape, the collective works, have tried to paper over it. Certainly, to borrow an expression that Nicola Sordo uses to describe Nietzsche's scholarship, there has pervaded a hermeneutic of innocence in Heideggerian scholarship which tries to divorce his work from the essentially political context that embeds it. Its political horizon, its class basis, its connection with Nazism, all these are things that any Marxist discussion on Heidegger should include. But we must ask, is this enough to defeat Heidegger? If he was simply a Nazi, why hasn't he, as Colin mentioned, been taken off philosophy shelves and put next to Goebbels, as Emmanuel Fay suggests? Why have so many leftist scholars in the global South and East, thinkers aware of Heidegger's Nazism, turned in various parts of their work to Heidegger for insights? Unlike the tradition of Western Marxism, where the eclecticism is intimately connected to a politics that throws on the support of imperialism a radical veneer, a lot of these scholars are fervent critics of US imperialism and have stood for decades on the side of socialist construction. Why does, for instance, the late Bolivian Marxist, Juan José Bautista Segales, find that he can incorporate insights from Heidegger's critique of modernity into the process of understanding the dimensions of the indigenous struggle for socialism, a struggle that must necessarily tarry with the question of capitalist modernity? Why does the Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff, one of the founders of the radical Christian socialist liberation theology tendency, central to so many socialist and anti-imperialist struggles in Latin America, turn to Heidegger to discuss the question of care and ethics? In his prison notebooks, Antonio Gramsci reminds us that, quote, a new science must prove its efficacy and vitality when it demonstrates that it is capable of confronting the great champions of the tendencies opposed to it, and when it either resolves by its own means the vital questions which they have posed, or demonstrates in peremptory fashion that these questions are false problems, end quote. Gramsci would go on to lambast Nikolai Bukharin, in part, for failing to address in his manual the critics of Marxism in their utmost coherence, that is, for failing to deal with the rest of bourgeois philosophy the best that bourgeois philosophy and science had to offer, opting instead to obtain the quick victories one gets when they challenge an opponent of a lower caliber. Gramsci says that while reading Bukharin's text, quote, one has the impression of someone who cannot sleep for the moonlight and who struggles to massacre the fireflies in the belief that by doing so, he will make the brightness lessen or disappear, end quote. Unfortunately, a similar fatal flaw can be observed in the traditional Marxist-Leninist critiques of Heidegger. Far from engaging with his work honestly and comprehensively, we have opted for quick victories based on dismissals of his thought as petty bourgeois, subjectivist, Nazi, etc. While components of this critique are certainly true, they are not enough. That is, they're not worthy of proper Marxist-Leninist critique. Yes, Marx, Engels, Lenin name-called their opponents and spoke of the class positions and subsequent political interests they often spoke from. But in conjunction with this was always a thorough demolishing of their arguments along the kind described by Gramsci previously. Additionally, how these thinkers expressed in their work and concerns a class position was something that was proved. That is, there was a concrete study of the relationship between the base and superstructure, between the class the thinker represents and the ideas they enunciate. This refined analysis has often been missing in our tradition's treatment of Heidegger. Far too often, conclusions that have to be proven are simply accepted at face value. As R.T. DeGeorge, who did an umbrella study of Marxist-Leninist writings on Heidegger up until the mid-1960s, argued, quote, the failure of Marxist criticism of Heidegger, as well as of other Western philosophers, is not necessarily that it has been wrong, but rather that most of it has been shallow, polemical, besides the point, and poor Marxism. Marxist criticism is difficult. Marxist-Leninist criticism has become too easy. It would perhaps be too much to ask that Marxists follow Lenin's advice and criticize not in the manner of Feuerbach, but in the manner of Hegel. That is, not merely rejecting views by correcting them, deepening them, generalizing them, and extending them, showing their connection and transition of each and every concept. But this is presumably what Marxist and Marxist-Leninist philosophy should do, end quote. DeGeorge is, of course, not a Marxist, but he is right to call us out on this shortcoming. In doing so, he is being a good ideological enemy, an enemy that, to use an obscene American expression, wants us to get our shit together. In the 20th century, the best inroads into the Marxist-Leninist critique of Heidegger would be made by George Lukács, who situates him within the irrationalism of the imperialist period in his seminal Destruction of Reason. Here, Lukács is correct about what it takes to carry forth critique in a proper Marxist manner. He writes, quote, to reveal a thinker's social genesis and function is of the greatest importance, but in itself by no means sufficient. Granted, the objectivity of progress will suffice correctly to condemn as reactionary an individual phenomenon or orientation. But a really Marxist-Leninist critique of reactionary philosophy cannot permit itself to stop at this. Rather, it must show in real terms, in the philosophical material itself, the philosophical falsity and the distortion of basic philosophical questions, the negation of philosophy's achievement, and so on. To this extent, an immanent critique is a justified and indeed indispensable element in the portrayal and exposure of reactionary tendencies in philosophy. The classic Marxist authors constantly used it. Engels, for example, in his Anti-Düring, and Lenin in his Imperial Criticism. To reject immanent criticism as one element in an overall survey, also embracing social genesis and function, class characteristics, exploration of the true nature of society, and so on, is bound to lead to a philosophical sectarianism, to the attitude that everything which is axiomatic to a conscious Marxist-Leninist is also immediately obvious to his readers. Therefore, while the antithesis between the various bourgeois ideologies and the achievements of dialectical and historical materialism is the self-evident foundation of our treatment and critique of the subject matter, we must still prove in factual, philosophical terms the inner incoherence, contradictoriness, etc., of the separate philosophies as also unavoidable if one wants to illustrate the reactionary character in a truly concrete way. End quote. This is precisely the task that Lukács sets for himself in this monumental text. However, as he tells us, it is a task that he cannot possibly complete in one book, even an 800-page one. The Heidegger section, for instance, is a mere 25 pages. Even shorter is his treatment of Heidegger in Existentialism or Marxism, published a few years after. Nonetheless, it is on the basis of this limited work that a proper Marxist-Leninist critique of Heidegger can be developed. Lukács tells us that with Heidegger, phenomenology, quote, turned into the ideology of the agony of individualism in the imperialist period, end quote. He performed a terminological camouflaging of subjective idealism, a, quote, transference of purely subjective idealist positions into objective, i.e. pseudo-objective ones. His ontological materiality and claims to concreteness remained purely declarative, dominated through and through by irrationalist arbitrariness and an epistemological hocus pocus. Even in the aspects of his thought that are historical, what is operative, Lukács argues, is, quote, the transformation of real history into a mythified pseudo-history. In Heidegger, the Husserlian tendency towards a strict scientific approach, intuitivist and irrationalist though it might have been in its own right, had now faded completely. Philosophy's task was to, quote, keep investigation open by means of questions. The discipline is turned into a big question rigmarole centered on a question of being that had already been answered by the discipline more than a century prior in Hegel's Science of Logic, where it was shown in its indeterminacy to be indistinguishable from nothing, impelling us to move beyond pure being into being as coming to be and ceasing to be, being as becoming, determinate being, and all the subsequent categories unfolded out of these in the logic. The context which situates the rise of Heidegger, Lukács writes, is akin to the post-1848 context which saw the rise of Soren Kierkegaard's romantic individualist agony. I quote Lukács. Kierkegaard's philosophy was aimed against the bourgeois idea of progress, against Hegel's idealist dialectics, whereas the renovators of existentialist philosophy, Heidegger and others, were already principally at odds with Marxism, although this seldom found overt and direct expression in their writings, end quote. This mood of despair, for Lukács, produced, like it had decades prior, an ideology, quote, of the saddest Philistinism, of fear and trembling, of anxiety, which was precisely the social psychological reason for the influence of Heidegger and Jaspers on the eve of Hitler's seizure of power. It was, quote, a yearning to rescue naked existence from universal collapse, end quote. Philosophically, it was marked by an attempt at third ways beyond idealism and materialism and rationalism and irrationalism, but in each instance, idealism and irrationalism ultimately showed dominance. While his phenomenology and ontology were, in Lukács's words, little more than, quote, abstract mythicizing, a vitalistic anthropology with an objectivistic mask, end quote, it nonetheless provided, he admits, an often grippingly interesting description of the intellectual Philistinism during the crisis of the imperialist period. In its phenomenological description of the authenticity of everyday existence, pervaded by Verfallensein, a state of falling prey, we come under the anonymous dominance of das Man, the one or the they. Lukács argues that Heidegger's detailed description of this fallen state, quote, constitutes the strongest and most suggestive part of being in time, and in all likelihood they form the basis of the book's broad and profound effect. It is here, with the tools of phenomenology, that Heidegger gives a series of interesting images taken from the inner life, from the worldview of the dissolute bourgeois mind of the post-war years, end quote. While he was fundamentally unable to understand the socio-historical causes that grounded such experience, Lukács holds that the value of his account is seen in the fact that, quote, it provides, on the descriptive level, a genuine and true-to-life picture of those conscious reflexes which the reality of the post-war imperialist capitalism triggered off in those unable or unwilling to surpass what they experience in their individual existence and to go further towards objectivity, that is, towards the exploring of the social historical causes of their experiences, end quote. Here, Heidegger would follow to the T the tradition of irrationalism which preceded him and of which he becomes a central figure of in the 20th century. As Lukács writes in Existentialism or Marxism, quote, in times of the crisis of imperialism, when everything is unstable, when everything is in disarray, when the bourgeois intelligentsia is forced to observe as the next day refutes what seemed indestructible today, it is faced with a choice. It must admit either its own defeat or the defeat of reason. The first path means recognizing your inability to comprehend reality and thought. Here it would be the turn of reason. But it is from this rationality that bourgeois thinking must withdraw. It is impossible to recognize this defeat from a bourgeois standpoint, for that would mean a transition to the camp of socialism. Therefore, at the crossroads, the bourgeois intelligentsia must choose a different path, must proclaim the collapse of reason, end quote. While the scope of the work leads Lukács sometimes to move too quick in his critique of Heidegger, his situating of him in the tradition of irrationalism and its rejection of the Enlightenment is a thread that must be picked up and developed by Marxist scholarship on Heidegger. Best place I have seen this done is in Domenico Losurdo's Heidegger and the Ideology of War, published first in Italian in 1991 and in English a decade after. Here it is lucidly shown how Heidegger and the Nazis inherited the Kriegsideologie, the war ideology of the post-World War I period, rooted in a mythical Gemeinschaft community, inhibited by an equally dubious notion of fate, Schicksal, and a fetish of death and its proximity as central to authentic life. Reason, which is tied to civilization and society, Gesellschaft, is lambasted for tearing communal bonds and breaking from the community's destiny. The Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and Marxism, which takes the rational kernels of the former to the historical and logical conclusion, are necessarily condemned. The rejection of modernity and the Enlightenment has been a fad in Western academia for decades. Heidegger alone is not to blame, but he is, as a fellow traveler of the tradition of Irrationalism, a key voice in the anti-modernity and anti-Enlightenment discourse. The Enlightenment, although imperfect and filled with contradictions, brought with it the notion of a universal humanity that we all share in as rational creatures, that provides for us the ability to see and fight for progress in history. It represented the thought of the bourgeoisie in its most progressive moment, before it undeniably turns into a force of reaction after the 1848 revolutions. The universalist ideals of the Enlightenment have been given concrete content through the various progressive struggles of the last 3 centuries, from the American Revolution to the French, to the Haitian, to the socialist and anti-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. Those who have stood against it have been the forces of reaction, those who deny our common humanity in favor of tribalism, usually of a hierarchical and supremacist kind. It has been the reactionary and conservative forces who have historically rejected the use of reason and the notion of progress, since both of these can provide challenges to the ruling order, an order which can become the object of critique through reason, and which can be shown through an appeal to the progressive dialectical unfolding of history, or, to use Martin Luther King Jr.'s expression, through an appeal to the arc of the moral universe that bends towards justice, to be just a moment in humanity's development towards greater freedom. Central to any Marxist critique of Heidegger, then, is also considering how this fundamental rejection of the Enlightenment, necessary for bourgeois philosophical irrationalism and its turn towards indirect apologetics of the system, takes alternative forms after Heidegger. John Bellamy Foster has done important work in this area, showing how currents dominating contemporary social sciences in academia like postmodernism, post-Marxism, post-colonialism, post-humanism, etc., all share a foundation in philosophical irrationalism and its indirect apologetics of the dominant order. Although with certain downfalls, the work of Susan Neiman in Left is Not Woke also does a swell job in showing how the tribalism central to contemporary wokeism is fundamentally rooted in the reactionary, anti-modernist, and anti-Enlightenment tradition, which Heidegger is a central figure of. For all the claims to being woke, this dominant ideology in the liberal wing of capital is deeply ignorant of the reactionary philosophical foundations underlying their worldview, a worldview that serves to reinforce the dominant order under the delusion that it is waging an emancipatory attack on it. A Marxist critique of Heidegger, therefore, must also contain an awareness of how the tradition he works through has seeped into the academic and activist left, often giving its deeply reactionary philosophical foundation a seemingly progressive gloss. For this, we must study the work of our colleague, Gabriel Rockel, who outlines the political economy of knowledge that has facilitated and promoted this eclecticism to counter the genuine communist left. In sum, while necessary, exposing Heidegger's Nazism and his thought's class basis is insufficient to defeating him. As Gramsci and Lukács have argued, we must also beat these monumental figures of contemporary bourgeois thought in the realm of ideas as well, showing how the problems they pose are baseless or how the responses they provide to real problems are insufficient. These are things that must be shown, not just taken axiomatically for granted simply because we understand the Marxist worldview to be the most advanced humanity has given rise to. If in questions of ethics or meta-historical narratives, comrades of the left, like the two I previously mentioned, turn to Heidegger, it is not sufficient to just lambast them for taking partial insights from a problematic thinker. We must also inquire into what deficiency is there in our answering or even asking of the problem that led them to turn to Heidegger. How can the Marxist worldview extend itself to commenting concretely on every possible topic of intellectual inquiry, such that the need to turn to Heidegger or any other bourgeois thinker is superfluous for those within our tradition? This requires an explicit turn away from the Western Marxism accepted in the academy. This so-called Marxism, imbued with postmodernist sensibilities, cringes at the description of Marxism as an all-encompassing worldview. They wish to limit Marxism to the sphere of history and social analysis, rejecting the dialectics of nature and the fruitful insights the dialectical materialist worldview can provide in any sphere of investigation. In China, where Marxism-Leninism has been able to develop relatively peacefully since at least 1949, The tendency is towards the contrary. The more fields the Marxist worldview can be present in, the merrier. I would like to conclude with a quote from Cheng and Fu's China's Economic Dialectic. Quote, Marxism is a telescope through which we can clearly see the trends according to which reality develop, and a microscope through which we can see its crucial details. It is a set of night vision goggles. Excuse me. It is a set of night vision goggles through which we can see at a deeper level, a fluoroscope through which we can see into the nature of the matter beyond the level of appearance, and a megaloscope through which we can make sense of blurred images. Marxism is a reflector through which we can see the truth behind things, a polygonal mirror that enables us to see the diversity and unity of opposites, an asymptotic mirror that allows us to see things near and far with multiple focal points, and a monster revealing mirror in which, if we have sharp eyes, we can see mistakes clearly. End quote. This should help to get us to see Marxism as an all-encompassing worldview, a worldview which, as Lenin told the young communists in 1921, absorbs and develops upon the knowledge of all the treasures created by mankind. When we are successful in this task, the need for anyone in the camp of the genuine progressive forces to turn to Heidegger or any other bourgeois thinker would be superfluous, since they would find a much more concretely explicated account for their inquiry within the tradition itself, or, at the very least, the tools to do so themselves ready to hand. And that last pun was intended. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Carlos. We have a little bit over 45 minutes for questions. I'm going to sort of start us off with a sort of a synthetic question to everyone. But those of you who are in the Zoom room, if you want to, use the hand raise function, we can follow that. And then the YouTube, I think the questions are going to be sort of put into chat. So we'll wait for those to come in. But I'm going to just sort of start us off. I have a question for all three of you. And really to cut to the chase, it's like I want to hear from all of you about perhaps how to synthesize this. Is there something that we can say, or can we give a theoretical determination to what we're saying about Heidegger and Heidegger's philosophy from a historical materialist vantage point? I think, starting with what Carlos was pointing out, it's not sufficient to really to point out that Heidegger's a bourgeois philosopher and point out his class position. This has been done. I mean, that's maybe the first step. But we need to go beyond this and really engage in sort of an imminent critique of his philosophy. And I see it as there is indeed, I think, and this is sort of gets to what each one of you in your own way pointed out, there's something perhaps disingenuous about the Heideggerian ontology that he creates. And I'm thinking specifically of Being in Time, which is sort of ironic given the category of transparency, der Zeitlichkeit, that he goes on about the transparency of Dasein to itself and all this. Also, I think another sort of place to maybe talk about the shared threads is Lukács. You all mentioned Lukács in one way or another, and his critique of Heidegger and the destruction of reason. The destruction of reason basically argues that fundamental ontology, as Carlos pointed out or quoted, is a sort of a pseudo-objective camouflage for the old sort of subjective idealism. And moreover, as Colin pointed out, the ecstatico-horizontal temporality of Dasein that's worked out in Being in Time is actually sort of a subtle, tacit attack on an objective materialist account, objective historical materialist account of time, dialectical account of time. And especially, in Being in Time, right, it's this ends up sort of this ecstatico-horizontal temporality of Dasein that he asserts ends up being more primal than the materialist account of time, right? More originary, right? And he also, I see in this move, when he makes historicity sort of a feature of the structure of Dasein's equiprimordiality, right? When he makes historicity a feature of Dasein, this move is there too. Yeah, and so again, just to reiterate, right, I think that Lukács' critique comes down to the idea that really what is, at least in Being in Time, what Heidegger's up to is he's ontologizing, right, the social phenomenon of reification. And thus, to speak to what Daniel said, right, there's also the question of inheritance, right? And I see in this ontologization of reification, which is a historically contingent phenomenon under the capitalist mode of production, it's sort of, in ontologizing it, it creates almost like a Trojan horse, right? That ends up compromising, infiltrating, if you will, the philosophies that are some way influenced by Heidegger. And in particular, we're thinking of like French philosophy, post-structuralism, whether it's Derrida, Foucault, even Deleuze. So again, to reiterate, I sort of did a little bit of summary here, but what is the thread, especially in terms of an immanent critique, that connects all your talks, and what can we say as sort of like a general theoretical determination from a historical materialist vantage point of Heidegger's philosophy? So, and then we'll open it up. I see Daniel has his hand up, so I'll let you all attend to that.
So leaving aside the kind of contingency of Heidegger as being born out of post-war ideology, which I think Lasordo, his book on Heidegger, is very excellent on this, because he uses, I think, a very rigorous method of comparing Heidegger to everyone around him on similar topics and showing that there's a common conversation. But leaving that question aside, I think, like, very broadly, what people see in Heidegger as attractive is a solution to the subject-object distinction, the relationship between thinking and being, because Heidegger claims to solve this with being in the world. And what he ends up doing, and I want to think about this a bit more with later Heidegger stuff, but he seems to just like not even talk about Dasein later, but just talk about things as if their subject-object has been resolved. But I think the dialectical way of understanding this relationship, which is to understand that the subject and object are distinct and that they are unified. Like, you have to understand it both as different and unified. Otherwise, you collapse everything. And this is what the problem is with the way people use ontology and philosophy post-Heidegger. People talk about the coloniality of being, right? And they say there's an ontology of coloniality. Like, they're not talking about the real things, though. They're talking about structures of meaning. But this language, this collapsing of the subject-object distinction, collapses meaning into being and being into me. But we need to distinguish those. We need to, Heidegger hates Descartes, but one of the best moments in Descartes, and Althusser turns to this, because Spinoza mentions it, is when Descartes like points out the difference between the sun looks small and I can cover it with my hand, but that's in me, and that's how the sun produces an effect in me. And mathematics tells me how the sun really is. This subjective-objective distinction, I think, is actually worth defending as long as we understand we don't separate them and run into a dualism with them. So that's I think, very generally where I think Heidegger is ideologically influential on academia, and where we might attack him. And this, my other piece and this piece, are both different aspects of Heidegger collapsing objectivity into subjectivity.
And if I can just piggyback off of that real quick, I think that's already accomplished by Marxism. I think one of the central breakthroughs that comes out of the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which Engels described as the document that holds the germ of a new outlook. It's this overcoming of this artificial bifurcation that has been sustained in philosophy between subject and object, not by collapsing it into Dasein, but by understanding it as a contradiction, a unity of opposites, and grasping it through the notion of practice, practical critical activity, or praxis, as Lukács will later on. But what does Lenin tell us in his reading of the 11th thesis? He tells us that this is a Hegelian critique of the young Hegelians and contemplative materialism. So the overcoming of the subject-object dichotomy in its stale form, divided by hard and fast lines, was already accomplished by Hegel. In many ways, Heidegger's attempt is as we like to say in Spanish, no le llega ni a los tobillos. It doesn't even get to the ankles of what was accomplished by Hegel and then refined even further by Marx.
Yeah, this has been very fascinating. I mean, part of what I wanted to touch on that I didn't get the time to elaborate is this idea that there emerges a sort of view in post-Marxism that there is an unalterable superstructure. and Heidegger's theory of ontology or of ontological difference gets sort of superimposed upon that. And there's a couple sort of symptoms that have emerged with this that I've located in my studies. And the first is a kind of pessimism about the activation of large-scale politics to effectuate a change in the superstructure. Part of this, I think, is a hangover of the events of the Chinese Cultural Revolution as leading to a perception amongst many contemporary Marxists that the superstructure is somehow a zone of social life that is unalterable. And that another effect then is also that the Marxist philosopher, equipped with a Heideggerian conception of ontology, has a tendency to overprivilege the power of thought as an autonomous force of social change. And there's been many people that have written about how Heidegger's influence on contemporary Marxism has, in a certain sense, paradoxically weakened practice, right? And so the Heideggerian influence on contemporary Marxism has kind of created a sort of perverse intellectualism within academic Marxism. Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacoue-Labart convened a very important convening of what they call the post-political analysis right at the collapse of the USSR in France. This is where Derrida famously gave his lecture on the ends of man, right? So in this conception, no longer is it merely the end of metaphysics, it's also the end of revolutionary socialism, right? According to these French Marxists. It's also the end of the human as such, right? It's a very important event that Lacoue-Labart and Nancy organize. And so politics becomes, say for Nancy, right, a sort of rare moment in which there's this distinction between politics and the political, la politique and les politique in French. And this distinction, I think, results in a type of new form of political pessimism where everything is sort of hinged upon the rarity of the event, and a new form of even spontaneism comes back into play in some sense. So those are some of the concerns that I have about Heidegger's general influence that I wanted to touch upon. And I'll stop there. I don't know if that answers exactly your question, Jared, but there's so much to be said about this. I feel like we need multiple events to tease out all of these points. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is great, and obviously we could talk about this for 5 hours or beyond. Yeah, I also think I think I agree with this idea. I would also then add that you maybe even see the exertion of Heidegger's influence on things like Afro-pessimism, which has this sort of tendency to ontologize socially contingent, historically contingent determinations, right? But also, like, in someone who's very vocally critical about Heidegger, like Jacques Rancière's politics and his philosophy, very much returns to almost like a voluntarism, a spontaneism, right? Where it's just this pure politics becomes this eventual rupture of a distribution of the sensible. But this ends up cashing out as a sort of idealist philosophy of history where you have distributions of the sensible and then a rupture and then another distribution of the sensible. As Gabriel has actually pointed out in many of his writings on Rancière. So I think there's a lot of threads that we can track here. I'm going to mute myself because we're going to go to Daniel Allen. Daniel, you want to just jump on and pose your question here?
Yeah, thanks. Can everybody hear me? Everything good? Okay. Thanks so much for this talk. It's really been great. Colin, Daniel, Carlos, really good food for thought. I've recently been reading a lot of Gramsci and been thinking a lot about how, as intellectual workers, we can best engage with these sorts of texts. And for a while, I'd kind of resigned Heidegger to, old likes and now new cringe. But you're kind of reanimating an interest in taking this up. But I want to specifically address Carlos's talk and ask you a question that sort of, I agree with entirely with what you're saying about engaging with Heidegger in a very sort of deep way that takes his thoughts seriously. And what I want to ask about that is, you know, as intellectual workers, we all tend to have this sort of what a career hazard of being sort of trapped in our own conversation, and not sort of linked always in the best way, that entire conversation, that is, to the greater struggles that are taking place in various places. And we're also formulating these theories on the basis of previous conversations that may have happened completely out of relation to past struggles, and may have picked up on ideas or popular themes that were actually living in places outside of the academy, if we can kind of talk about that. And so what I'm interested in is, what about the role of dethroning people like Heidegger? To some extent, take whatever is popular or powerful within Heidegger and give it back to some other tradition that is maybe, you know, not so much influenced by Heidegger, but something else, right? I think that's particularly important. And so sometimes these days I tend to err towards, you know, scoffing at sort of bourgeois intellectualism, not because I think there's nothing there, but because I think it tends to take its own value so greatly that its practice is sort of modified around preserving that value. And we all run into that problem when we do this job. You can't be above that. So I'm not condemning what you're doing, but I'm sort of wondering, like, what's the praxis side of critiquing Heidegger? How do we do that without sort of preserving Heidegger as a kind of fetishized space of prestige in the academy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. To double down on what Colin said in his presentation, and this is something that Colin and I have talked about, there is something not just about Heidegger, but about all of these thinkers that are really hard to get through. That's kind of like an enjoyment that you reap from reading it and understanding it, in the same way that, you know, people pick up crossword puzzles that are mentally challenging and find that stimulation enjoyable. And we do want to prevent like us giving ourselves a task that rationalizes giving us time for just experiencing that sort of enjoyment of taking down Heidegger or whoever else it might be. Now, I think that I do agree with the tradition, and I consider myself a part of it, of intellectuals that have to, you know, not just interpret and challenge these ideas, but actively be in the struggle. And I would say 80% of my work is political commentary, streams, more popular forms of education. But you know, intellectuals also have a distinctive role that can't just be fulfilled by regular working class people simply because of the sort of life activity that they're forced to engage with. And our role for the movement, if we're serious and are able to attach the distinctive parts of our interest to the working class's interest, is taking down these ideologies, these worldviews in their level of the utmost coherence. Precisely because when they're formulated in the academy, that's when they're the strongest. If we take them down where they're the strongest, when they get trickled down through the iron triangle of the academy, the media, and NGOs, and you find them in activist spaces, and you find them in some parties, and in just the general cultural milieu of the left, you've already defeated it at its best. It becomes easier to defeat it in those more perverse and incoherent forms. Um, and if you can tie that in a popular way, as we've done today, where I think the vast majority of people who don't have to be enlightened in the history of philosophy, they would understand what I think we've all tried to address. So and be able to take up those tools to perform that criticism of the semblances of Heidegger that are still at work today. And I think part of the critique, and um, this is why, like, and this might take me to another topic that's perhaps a little bit closer to Jared's initial question. Um, but part of what I think is not absence, but what I would have liked Lukács to do a little bit more of, had he lived 100 years longer, or others who are taking up the same project, is it's really good, especially when this thought seeps into the Marxist left, to show how it's un-Marxist, how it's sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly a challenge of Marxism. But we also have to defend and argue for why it's wrong. You know, just saying it's un-Marxist or not dialectical or not materialist is not enough. We have to argue actively, constantly, why it is correct to have a dialectical and materialist understanding of the world, and why, therefore, in that being a challenge to it, it is wrong. And why, in being wrong, we stifle our ability to actually fight for a better world. And some of this gets annoying because it forces us to repeat arguments that have already been made by the central figures of our tradition. But repetitio mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of all knowledge in many ways. One of the things that I've had to deal with as someone who comments on politics quite often through live streams and broadcasts is that you have to repeat things a million times because you don't know if there's new people in the audience that haven't heard it before. So yes, it's important to talk about how it's not Marxist and a challenge to Marxism, but we also have to constantly tie the defense of why Marxism itself is correct and why in that attack of Marxism it is wrong.
All right, that's great. Thank you.
Anyone else want to speak to Daniel's question about praxis?
I can say something very briefly. I mean, I think it's almost impossible to extricate Heidegger's influence on philosophy as such, given its transformative effects. What I think would actually be quite more useful for the cause of revolutionary socialism is to perform what I would consider to be a historical materialist analysis in the form of a Lukács and Pierre Bourdieu on thinkers of the past, like Nietzsche and Heidegger. And in Bourdieu's text on Heidegger, what we have is a very sophisticated sociological historical analysis of the social being that is projected and that is therefore embedded within the concepts or the repertoire of concepts that Heidegger invents. And that is a useful way, I think, for people to get a grasp on how philosophy is constructed. In the case of Heidegger, it can never be underestimated the social conditions of decadence and social decay and social misery to which his philosophy is a response, right? And that, I think, holds for the analysis of any philosopher and the generation of their concepts. So that would be one way to one of the reasons that's helpful for people is because it's a great avenue into the complexity of the philosophical concepts and all of the neologisms and words that are concepts that are invented and so on, as a precursor in, as a way in. Then, of course, you can supplement that with philosophy, but you have to keep in mind one of the reasons that Heidegger was so popular is because his early work was reintroducing young students to a completely new way to understand the Greeks and pre-Socratic philosophy. So he already had made a kind of seismic contribution at the level of modern philosophy's understanding of the ancient Greeks. And then from there, he, in Being in Time and then later work, makes commentaries, imminent commentaries on modernity, the social condition of modern life, you see. So that's another thing, which is there's a big difference there between philosophy as philology or philosophy as an exegesis in the Greeks versus the philosopher as an intellectual. Being in Time is philosophy as an intellectual enterprise that is fundamentally engaged in social and political concerns. It's at that moment that the Lukácsian and the Bourdieuist analysis will be most helpful. You see my point? Because that's why Lucien Goldman can say that Being in Time is a response to Lukács, because it's an intellectual contribution to the polemics of a very particular time period.
Yeah, thanks. Can I respond, or is there time for that? Just to clarify a little bit. Well, another thing that I'm worried about is the intellectual work that goes in a bad direction sometimes and doesn't name its influences in people like these. So the development of technocracy out of the sort of late 19th, early 20th century sort of developments, both in the Methodenstreit and then within the conflicts in society, right, you see emerging this sort of what do I want to say? Arbitrary technocratic power based on an intellectual authority that has the ability to make certain arbitrary decisions and is sort of backed up by capital or state power or whatever it needs. And so what I'm thinking about here, right, is Heidegger is right in that moment, right? Like he's in the interwar period. He's touching on scars. Like Europeans are sitting there looking at a world that used to have memories of the past all over it. And much of that memory is ruined and rubble now. And everybody is sort of living in this. I mean, it's a compartmentalized view because they're not thinking about what Europe has done to the rest of the world, but it's their home. So they're feeling it. And Heidegger's really fingering that. And, you know, the Nazis are too. And it's this moment of convergence. And so for me, there's an importance to kind of step into that and not just, you know, kind of take it to the level of conversation where we're trying to show that Marxists are there. But I agree, that's absolutely, you guys have totally convinced me. I hadn't thought about it in the way you were thinking about it. So I agree with that. But I'm also worried about confronting technocracy by reinvesting intellectual power in the people. So that means like going to people like Heidegger and saying, Heidegger's talking about possibility. Sans the question of dialectic or Marxism. How can the concept of possibility be utilized to mobilize people who see themselves not necessarily in line with Marxism, such that they may actually come to see themselves in line with something like Marxism? Is what I is. So I'm asking about. I guess I already have my own kind of not fully developed views about this, but what kind of work can we do additionally with this material? You know, in addition to sort of clarifying its relation to materialism as both a kind of legitimation of materialism and also a further exploration of materialism, but also using it to restore a connection between intellectual activity and popular movements and kind of beat back against this sort of IP world we're entering into right now, is sort of what I'm thinking. If that makes sense. I just want to kind of clarify what my concerns are so it doesn't seem, I'm not interested in dismissing them because they're not Marxist or anything like that. I'm just worried about how can we actually as intellectuals start taking advantage of our power, like really doing as intellectuals.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, I think there's a few things at play. Well, one of the, like, we're not just speaking abstractly in general, right? We are in a context in the US where the dominant left is very middle class, it's very PMC, and the inclination of how can we continue to insert ourselves and it's a very sort of one-sided understanding that often dominates how we think about the relationship of intellectuals to the working class. And I think we're at a stage where we must step back and think, what can the intellectuals learn first about themselves as a either class position or um, stratum within a class, whatever you want to classify us? What can we learn about ourselves and in the process about our relationship to working people and working people themselves in order to avoid the sort of systematic disconnection, which I think most of us would agree is at play between a very PMC intellectualized left and the working class. So any relationship of teaching is going to have to include in our time a process of learning, a process of imbuing ourselves in the sort of life world of working people, of not just, and I mean something very concrete here. I think for a good chunk of the left in most institutions, if they were to hang out with the blue collar workers that I hang out with here in the Midwest, these people would be canceled in 5 minutes, right? So that sort of relationality that's produced by the culture that we imbue ourselves with when we come out of the academy, that's something that has to be reflected. You know, the a priori assumption that we're the enlightened ones, as soon as there's a mode of relationality that I engage with, even if it's workers, that's not the one that I'm with, they're backwards, I'm enlightened. And the relationship is one-sided, and that's incorrect. We have to, in a way, humble ourselves, understand our working class, and in that way, we can fulfill the very essential role that intellectuals, both organic and traditional, have for the class struggle. And as far as the means to doing that, I think one of the things that is clear for people who are serious about Marxism is that you're not going to accomplish that task by publishing in academic journals, right? It's necessary for all of us, for our careers, to have a job, to have a roof over our head. But most of our work as genuine Marxists or Marxist-Leninist communist thinkers should be in popular forums and things that are accessible to people. That doesn't mean stupefying or dumbifying our work, but it means constantly having the question at hand, how is it that I can present this in a way that is relevant and that everyone, regular working class people tuning in through their phones, can understand it? So those are the sort of questions that I think I try to think about very often as an intellectual myself.
If we want to, actually, there's now some questions from the YouTube stream they're going in. You guys want to pass this? Maybe you can fold in sort of response to Daniel to these questions. And then, so the first comes from Martin Finicane. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He says, any thoughts regarding philosophical subjectivism in the style of Nietzsche and Heidegger and bourgeois economic doctrine? And then he adds to it, perhaps as a bit of a clarification, Martin has seen irrationalism posed as a refutation of Marx's labor theory of value. I would just add maybe to like this sort of opens the Pandora's box of the relationship between Nietzsche and Heidegger. And I'm thinking one thing we maybe just need to put on the table is Jeff Waite's book, Nietzsche's Corpse, right? Which actually, like, he situates this whole problem as he puts Heidegger as in line with Nietzsche as the sort of paragon of Nietzscheanism, right? But what he sees as really the ideological problem and the core theoretical problem is Nietzsche's esotericism, right? Which is implicitly from Plato to whoever, to Heidegger, is essentially elitist social doctrine. And this also feeds into what Daniel was talking about, of the influence, right? So it's like a question of Nietzsche's influence. But so we'll open it up to this question. We got another one. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's an exact connection between the subjectivism of Heidegger and the subjectivism of bourgeois economics. And I don't know, so much of bourgeois economics to me, especially the more extreme kinds like the Austrian school, like libertarian economics, is just almost so ideological that it's comical. Like there was the case in at the beginning of COVID, one of the people from von Mises Institute or something like, or no, it was a different libertarian think tank, was working with the Trump administration. And he went on and argued, he was like, no, if you just like leave COVID alone, all the people with bad COVID will die out. And then the people with less powerful COVID will be around and the virus will get weaker. So if you just let the market take care of it, then it'll like all fix itself, which is a crazy argument to make. But one thing that is important about the labor theory of value, which of course doesn't come from Marx, it comes from the classical economic tradition that Marx studied and worked out the contradictions of, is that Marx, through his analysis of it, coins or discovers the law of surplus value, that capitalist accumulation is driven by the creation of surplus value through the exploitation of labor. This is something that is completely missing from Heidegger's analysis of technology and his history of metaphysics. Heidegger thinks that Nietzsche's will to power is somehow responsible for technology everywhere and the airplane on the runway waiting to take off and things like that. And he doesn't see that. He sees this as driven by a will to power, as a will to utility. But that's not what's driving production. What's driving production is exchange value, the creation of exchange value, not the creation of use value, right? And so I think that contrast there between that the labor theory of value lets us see helps us criticize Heidegger for lacking this material base to his analysis of technology.
I would just jump in to comment on the Nietzsche point. Perspectivism is concocted as not a subjectivist orientation or theory of the subject, but it does have an implicit design of a class preservation intention. This is what Lukács means, by the way, of bourgeois philosophy, right? So in Lukács's time, there was an inevitability, a sense in bourgeois social life that the system of capitalism cannot continue. This is what is sometimes given the name of teleology, that fancy term teleology. And so part of the problem is after the Second World War, the idea of bourgeois society as a social form that is under a possible withering is abandoned by Marxists. This is the famous notion of Adorno and Horkheimer abandoning the working class, and French theory after 68 abandoning Marxism, and so on, at least classical Marxism. So Nietzsche and Heidegger in Losurdo and Lukács, in Waits and my own and other people's interpretations, are philosophers who reach a zenith, a pinnacle of bourgeois philosophy as a preserver. They're great preservers of the crisis of bourgeois philosophy, which means that their philosophy also contains a cultural effect, a superstructural effect, which means that their concepts go to invent, this goes to Daniel's point, the possibility of what intellectual life is or could be, right? So the invention of concepts from Nietzsche as an arsenal of what Nietzsche calls weapons for the ruling class is exactly imbued by Heidegger, the same modality. That's the esotericism. So the esotericism is founded here. For Nietzsche, he's encountering a different form of capitalism in the pre-imperialist period than is Heidegger. But in both instances, they are creating the kind of pinnacle or the zenith of the encapsulation of what bourgeois philosophy could preserve, right, in its crisis-prone state. So I think the question of Heidegger's lasting influence in the post-war period emerges differently precisely because Marxist philosophers somehow abandon the core presuppositions of class theory and of many other notions of classical Marxism. And when you bring those back in, Nietzsche and Heidegger, therefore, are then read differently, right? So that's what I would say to that.
Go for it,
If
Carlos.
if there's no other question around, I'd like to perhaps post a question or comment in response to some of the things that have been touched on tangentially in this discussion, which is the question of ontology itself. I think it's clear that part of the critique of Heidegger, and I mean, I would say of most bourgeois philosophy, specifically in the period where it has to take the form of indirect apologetics, where it has to defend capitalism through critiquing it in a very culturalist form. Central to that critique has been how they have ontologized, to a certain extent, things that are historically constituted. Products of history have come to be understood ontologically in a very trans-historical or ahistorical fashion. And that is something that we should, of course, critique. But I wonder to the extent to which ontology itself is something that we can engage with productively. Lukács's later work, a volume that has yet to be fully translated, we have 3 short chapters published, but it's called An Ontology of Social Being. So there's clearly a sense in which we could have a genuine materialist and dialectical understanding of ontology that treats the question of being not in this abstract and trans-historical manner, but that historicizes being such that being is always already understood as becoming. And that's the second pun. The first pun was ready to hand. The second one is the always already. I think this is a productive enterprise, and the way that I have come to think about dialectical materialism itself as a philosophy, as an all-encompassing worldview, as something that contains this ontology of becoming. There's certain claims that are central to the Marxist worldview that I don't know what else to categorize them as other than ontological. The world is in a constant state of flux, inherited from Heraclitus. The engine of movement in the world is contradiction. Contradiction is not the way of opinion, as Parmenides hinted at, but the essential core behind the movement that we see as constant in the world. You know, there's a certain lawfulness to this movement, and there's a certain way of relating parts to whole. So there's comments that we make that are central to our tradition, that we make about nature, the whole world, about human society, and about thinking itself, that I don't know how else to categorize them other than ontological in character. So I think we have to make some form of clarification that when we're criticizing these people for ontologizing things that are historically constituted, we're referring to a specific ahistorical, transhistorical ontology of being qua being, instead of a dialectical materialist ontology of being qua becoming, which is not only possible, but already in the Marxist worldview when it's formulated explicitly.
That yeah, I totally agree. There's some more comments or questions here from the chat, so we maybe want to advance to those so we can get to them. Robert M, I believe from the YouTube stream, asks, is there any limited space for a materialist phenomenology along the lines of like Merleau-Ponty, probably thinking of like Michel Henry as well, for both a critique and recontextualization of Heidegger along Marxist lines? Or is this, I guess is the other possibility, is this just contradictory or impossible?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking a lot about actually lately. And whenever I have a free window of time to write something, I want to do an article on Marx's concept of appearance. Because the first category from Hegel's logic that appears in capital is Erscheinung, appearance, which Hegel understands to be a higher determination of being, or of essence, than existence. Because existence is just what is, but what is has to take a mode of appearance for us to interact with it. Hegel says at one point, if he's like, Kant says all we deal with is appearances. And he says, damn right. And if things didn't appear, like we couldn't find food, right? Things have like, and that's the Hegelian twist on it. He takes what Kant sees as this problem and turns it into the solution to the problem itself. And Marx's concept of appearance is very interesting because exchange value, which is an objective concept that's materially constituted, is the Erscheinungsform, a form of appearance of value, which is the objective concrete thing, which is a product of a social relationship. So there is a sense of phenomena. There are phenomena. There is a phenomenology within Marxism. It's just embedded within social relations and within the material world. Similarly, and this is just like a side note, there's one point where Marx says that we only notice the labor of others put into the objects that we're using during the production process when they're like mouth-shaped and don't work. So there's already Heidegger's like, you know, the Huber-Dreyfus thing of like the hammer breaks and we don't notice it until it breaks in Marx in a certain way. So there are all these like elements of the Marxist tradition that already deals with appearance and already gives us the resources to talk about things that appear, like including like, I think that too, like this is important for talking about categories like racialization and gender, which are not materially grounded, or they're not materially real, but they're products of social relations. So that's where I think like there is a room for phenomenology, but where it gets into a problem, in my opinion, and I know this because I tried to do it and made this mistake in my earlier work, is when you try to start with intentionality and an analysis of consciousness and find materiality in your experience. I think you have to start with the break between matter and mind. Or rather start with matter, show how mind comes out of it and reflects back on the matter.
I would just point to two examples. Marcuse in the 1920s, before the rise of the Nazis, wrote a text on trying to reconcile historical materialism, which he refers to as a Marxist Heideggerian phenomenology. It's important to go back and read those interventions with hindsight, and then to then read Marcuse's later reflections on the errors of this attempt. One of the things that the French Marxists and post-structuralist Marxists, let's take Alain Badiou as an example, is that he will formulate in Being an Event a conception of what he calls later, actually in Logics of Worlds, actually part 2 of what he calls a subjective phenomenology. And keep in mind, he uses the influence of Heidegger and Heideggerian turn to ontology. He still retains that, but he says that we have to ground ontology off of mathematics and a new form of rationalism, as opposed to the mystical form of art and aesthetics and poetry, which is really the ground of Heidegger's notion of being in some sense. So there's been some examples of people. I would actually probably argue that Badiou gives us the best, let's say, post-Heideggerian attempt at a systematic philosophy, which includes a phenomenology, which is so-called post-human in some sense. Things get more complex. We don't have the time to get into that, but these projects do exist. I don't think that they're going to have the same humanist hue as the Merleau-Ponty approach, but they're out there. We didn't have time to get into it, but I mean, I think there are also strict left-wing Heideggerians coming out of Jean-Luc Nancy's very, very important work, which, you know, you should study it if you're not aware of it, because it's there that a whole post-metaphysical conception of the Mitsein, of the being with, is retained for a conception of what Nancy calls ontological communism. Now, ontological communism has been hugely influential for Judith Butler. And so Judith Butler, for example, in her remarks on the pandemic, leaned on what I would consider a left-wing Heideggerian defense of the protocols of the state apparatus during the pandemic, which is a very interesting side point. But that just is a point to show and to reveal the extent of Heidegger's embedded influence within the contemporary Marxist left, or leftist in general, I'd say.
Excellent. Yeah, there's another question here. So it is from Thomas Lammy. Does Heidegger have this influence anymore that he would need to be dethroned? Like Zizek answered to Peterson, where are the Marxists he sees everywhere? Where is the influence of Heidegger anymore? I guess it's for everyone.
Well, one of the things we've already kind of outlined is how Heidegger has been influential in all subsequent tendencies in bourgeois philosophy over the last century. And those, of course, trickle down into activist spaces and just general culture, such that, you know, ripping them out at their root, I think, is a productive enterprise. But if I could just answer real quick to the previous question about phenomenology, because we have a really good question from Helmut in the comments. I do think that there could be of a sort of phenomenology that is compatible with Marxism. When we look at the one thing that Lukács praises or considers to be central to the success of Heidegger's book was Being in Time specifically, is how gripping the description of this inner life was. It was using phenomenology to provide that. And I think that part of the central problem for Lukács is that there is no explanation at all of the social forces and historical factors that are the horizon, the background for that experience that is described phenomenologically. But if there was, there wouldn't necessarily be a problem with that phenomenological description from the standpoint of Marxism. And I think that someone who does this splendidly is actually W.B. Du Bois, who we consider at the Institute the father of American Marxism. Phenomenology, I think, is something that is done, that can be done quite productively through narratives and stories. And I think that this is what is accomplished in the Black Flame trilogy and most of Du Bois's narratives. It's a phenomenological account of the Black proletariat rooted in a dialectical materialist, historical materialist analysis of the social conditions that ground that phenomenological description. So I would definitely urge in favor of 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 leaving a space open for phenomenology within the confines of that Marxist approach, which means remembering, of course, what Colin mentioned, that the starting point cannot just be consciousness and intentionality, but this analysis of the social forces that have already preconditioned that.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. I also agree, like this idea of phenomenology. I argued in my dissertation work, at least, that I guess for me, it's a question of methodological basis of all this, right? If phenomenology is our point of departure to core, that's where we run into problems, whether it's in the form of fundamental ontology, a la Heidegger, or classical Husserlian phenomenology. But phenomenology, I think, if we have a dialectical materialist methodology, we can, in a sense, dialectize phenomenology. Phenomenology can be a moment in an articulation of a process that also exceeds the mere conscious experience, and that exceeds the mere phenomenality of things. So it's about, I guess, integrating dialectically a phenomenological account with a historical, structural, materialist account. But Heidegger, of course, as we've been describing, is sort of camouflages a subjectivism. It's what Lukács calls a pseudo-objectivism. He posits a subjective idealism as objectivity qua ontology, and that's the real move that is problematic. We have a comment, a really great comment, or a question, excuse me, from Helmut Lowen. I'll read it really quick. There has been scant reference in today's presentation to Heidegger as a fascist philosopher. That is, a philosopher who aligned his thinking with the precepts of National Socialism, a university administrator who presided over book burnings, a man whose visceral anti-Semitism was expressed in the crudest terms and on the level of metaphysical anti-Semitism. And if one examines the central categories of thought, a philosophy that is imbued with the blood and soil ideology of the Nazi Party, the meaning Dasein for Heidegger is to be found in the Volksgemeinschaft, or the Volkisch community defined by ethno-nationalist definitions. Other categories of his thought, including conceptions of nature, are deeply imbued with Nazi thinking and continue to influence contemporary European new right and neo-fascist thinking. And here's the upshot, I think. Do Heidegger's fascist commitments modify how he's to be read by historical materialists? Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I remember this in my own experience with Heidegger, where I took a course where we read Heidegger's Holy Land seminars as political texts, and that was the point that I was like, that was before like a lot of the stuff at the Black Notebooks had come out and all of that, and I was like, okay, this guy is definitely a fascist. Like, I think that transforms how we read Heidegger, because at that point we're reading Heidegger as an enemy. And I think reading people as enemies is useful at times. Like, for example, Heidegger in many ways is much worse than Hobbes, but I like reading Hobbes as an enemy. I like reading Hobbes as a description of how a certain concept, like how monarchy functions. And I think that Heidegger gives us insight into, I mean, the far right thinkers notice this immediately in Heidegger, that he does ground it. He is trying to ground a fascist politics through this weird reading of like Hölderlin and Nietzsche, and this sense of like history and destiny and being towards death and stuff like that. And so reading Heidegger as an enemy is, I think, the takeaway from what the awful things he did. And I think it's worth also just demolishing the defenses of Heidegger real quick. So sometimes it's claimed that Heidegger only joined the Nazi Party because he wanted to implement educational reforms. I was misled by this as a young kid and thinking that was what it was. Another common defense is that he just like joined the Nazis for a little bit, but being anti in the earlier stuff is fine, and then he like admitted it as a mistake or whatever. Then there's an attempt to, and this is actually what a lot of thinkers on the European New Right do, to separate Heidegger and like Spengler, Junger, and others from Nazism by calling them conservative revolutionaries and distancing them, when this is actually just an ideological aspect of that of National Socialism. So I think it's worth like debunking all those. And like there's a letter to his wife in like 1916 that says like the Jewification of Germany is taking it away from the folk or something like this. So it's like very clear this guy was a committed ethno-nationalist and fascist way back in 1916 already.
And the removal of the dedication to Edmund Husserl because Husserl was Jewish from being in time, right? Like all of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's an argument that's very often made, the one that you mentioned, Colin, that, well, being in time is not tainted because he wasn't a Nazi there. But I think this is where Lasordo's book on Heidegger comes in clutch, because it shows how it's part of this tradition of Kriegsideologie, war ideology, that is in many ways the ideological foundation for a lot of what's going on in the Nazi rhetoric and propaganda. Now, I think that part of the reason for like the scant references today is that this is already very well known. It's 2024. There's a plethora of really good books depicting how Heidegger was a Nazi POS, piece of shit. And we, this is known, and I think in all of our presentations, we hint at the fact that any like actual concrete like developed account always has to have that as a present component, including the class component behind it. But what's often missing in most of the discussions that I find in leftists, not just Marxists, but leftist academic critics of Heidegger, is an actual tackling of his ideas. And we do have to ask, I think, as I did in my presentation, okay, Manufay says we should put him next to Goebbels, right? That's all fine and dandy. It's a normative statement, but why hasn't it happened? Why does it continue to be the case that, at least in continental in programs that are very much rooted in continental philosophy, that Heidegger is still such a central thinker? Why isn't Goebbels there? You know, we can even ask the same thing of Schmidt. Like, these are horrible Nazis, but there's something to their thought that is still lingering around, and just calling it Nazi and devoting the whole seminar on that, although it would be productive, it's kind of already been done. I think our task is to expand beyond that. That means include that, but go beyond it as well, and tackle the thought itself, and tear it to shreds on its own account, not just its connection to Nazism, but on its own account, show how it's wrong.
We have one more question from the chat. We have like about 5 more minutes, so maybe if we can keep our responses somewhat programmatic here. It's Philip Hall. He says the petite bourgeoisie were pre-lapsarian. They did not want to join in with the collective struggle. They were not for the ruling class. And then the question here, I guess, is, was Heidegger petite bourgeois pre-lapsarian? And I take it you mean that theological language before. I'm not sure what the fall that's analogous here is, but yeah, was Heidegger a petite, aligned with his petite bourgeois class interests? Is the question.
So there is like this is something you find in a lot of thinkers, not just Heidegger, but this idea, this projection of the occupation of a philosopher into their philosophy. So you find it in Hegel, and Marx is brilliant about this in the 1844 manuscripts, to recognize that the reason Hegel sees all of history as thought thinking itself, this is a product of the class division between like thinking and working, and that Hegel is a thinker, and he doesn't think outside of his class division. He does talk about labor, like to some extent, like you got to give him credit, but he sees it as the movement of thought based on his kind of class position as an intellectual. I think Heidegger's the reason that people make this case that it's just about education for Heidegger, it's not just about education for Heidegger. He was a real Nazi, he was a real anti-Semite, and he was trying to create a German like folk Dasein. But there is this like feeling of basically like STEM taking over at this time in Germany in the intellectual like spheres. And this is like part of why he's so anti-science. And he says like things like science can't think, is because at that time, all of these people who fought in World War II from the working classes are coming into the university seeking to improve their class position. And so the structure of the university is changing. I think it's around this time that the Technische University in Germany, like the trade universities, are being converted into like normal like universities that were relegated to the intelligentsia, similar to like the GI Bill in the United States. And so there's this class restructuring of the university that's going on that I think informs Heidegger's really reactionary philosophy of education as well, is just being kind of, we need to go back to this model of philosophy leading everything and organizing all the sciences together towards being, or something along these lines.
Carlos, want to speak to that?
Perhaps just a couple things as to the petty bourgeois class position. This is a very broad umbrella term that we have used in the Marxist tradition, because technically, if you break it down, petty bourgeois, it's just like small shopkeepers, like small bourgeois. But that's not how we've used it. We've used it to describe what we would call in the US like middle classes, and intellectuals within, or white collar work. And it's been used in an extremely broad form. And I think it is in that sense where, Lenin's comments about the petty bourgeoisie being a vacillating class have to be understood. It's not a homogeneous entity. It's a class that can go one way or another. Um, and I think that in the context that Heidegger is working in, that's what that we're seeing. Part of the petty bourgeoisie is aligning itself with the rise of Nazism, and part of it is not. Part of it is in forces that are fighting against that rise. In any discussion about the rise of Nazism and the petty bourgeoisie, we should also try to avoid um, certain dogmas that have been inherited from parts of the Trotskyite analysis of the rise of fascism, which sees it as rooted simply in the petty bourgeoisie. I think this attempts to give a popular veneer, since the petty bourgeoisie is to a certain extent a popular class. It tries to give a popular veneer to what was essentially a top-down phenomenon. The rise of Nazism, fascism, is was always propped up by big business. I would recommend the work not just of Parenti, Black Shirts and Reds, but also the work of one of our colleagues, Jack Powell, Big Business and Hitler, that outlines how the most advanced and developed monopoly elements of finance capital were behind the rise of big business. And this is the tradition that the Third International, the Comintern, uh, uh, is working with, and understanding that the rise of fascism is rooted in capitalism's reaction to the crisis, and it is the most terroristic dictatorship that finance capital imposes on the people, on the working class, and on other forms of democratic struggles, rolling back the victories that were made by the working class for the sake of expanding the shortening rate of profit, which is what we see in these periods of crisis. So there is a petty bourgeois element that forms part of the base of the rise of fascism, but any discussion of the rise of fascism and the petty bourgeoisie must have as a central component in it the role of finance capital, the most advanced capital in backing and promoting fascism for its own interest.
All right. Thank you so much, Carlos. We're going to have to wrap it up here. Just want to thank again all of our presenters, Colin Boldale, Carlos Garrido, and Daniel Tutt. Also thank the Critical Theory Workshop, as well as Midwestern Marx. And thanks for everyone for attending, both on YouTube and here on Zoom. And thank you for your questions. Moreover, thank you for this wonderful discussion. Hopefully we can continue. And yeah, have a beautiful Saturday, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully the live stream is also stopped. I think Gabriel's doing that right now. Anyway, we can